I hope the sound is fine now. Yeah. Thank you for this kind introduction and the possibility to talk about Venus and Adonis myth and Rubens' interpretation of it. I wanted to talk about this in the Valentine week as it's about a love story, even if it's an unhappy one. But it does have some references to flowers or plants, and in general is a mythological story very much linked to spring, so it's really perfectly fitting. The depiction of the goddess of beauty, Venus, and Adonis, a young man famous for his beauty, presented an understandable, delightful challenge for painters. For example, the Italian poet Annibale Caro propagated Venus and Adonis as an outstanding subject for painters, and also recommended the antique poet Theocritus as a basis for it, with his description of accompanying nymphs, fates, and graces, and cupids punishing the boar. I will talk about later. I will talk about the myth, Rubens' different sources, and also about him as a painter of animals, as greyhounds are often depicted, and since these hunting dogs have often been attributed to Franz Sneiders, who specialized in depictions of animals, I thought it's interesting to compare the two painters in that regard. There are a number of myths surrounding Venus and Adonis. It's not just one clear story, which Rubens translated into emotive works. But let me first give you a short survey of which scenes he depicted from this myth. He worked on the subject Venus trying to restrain Adonis from departing for the hunt immediately after his stay in Italy in 1609, now in Düsseldorf, the painting you see at the left, and returned to the topic in his last decade in the 1630s, as you see on the right side in the painting now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The workshop may then have developed, parting from the version in Düsseldorf, its own version, which was to some extent sometimes retouched by Rubens on wood and smaller, since such cabinet paintings, which I will not discuss here, were easier to sell. They have also been copied very often, and many of them are still existing today in some private collections. Furthermore, Rubens already created a Venus weeping for the dead Adonis during his time in Italy, a painting which, according to Bellori, was made for Gian Vincenzo Imperiale in Genova. You see a copy of it on the left side. Rubens produced other paintings of the subject around 1612, which is now in the possession of the Jerusalem Museum, and for which a wonderful bozzetto is preserved in Dulwich Gallery in London, which will be the final point of my talk. There are 3 drawings on the subject, some of which are particularly touching, as in all of them, Venus is very close to the dead body of Adonis. They are loosely connected with each other, especially the left and the middle one, you see here, but in my opinion, they are not related to any surviving image. Moreover, Rubens painted an episode that is related to this myth, but depicts the goddess without her human lover. In Venus removing a thorn from her foot, or Venus wounded by a thorn, he thus created a very original solution, which I will treat in detail later. But first, let's start with the story. The story of the mortal lover or consort of the goddess of love was told by numerous authors already in antiquity. Here, once again, Ovid should be mentioned as particularly influential, which is why I brought with me some illustrated version of his Metamorphoses. Because there, in the 10th book, he describes the story of the beautiful Adonis, who is a consequence of Myrrha's treacherous incest with her father Cinyras. Out of shame, Myrrha, heavily pregnant with Adonis, asks to be transformed and becomes the myrrh tree that gives birth to beautiful Adonis. You see here in the print how the woman is getting the baby out of the tree. Several ancient authors connect Do you hear me? Okay, thanks. Several ancient authors connected the cycle of nature with the myth. In one variation, Venus entrusts the lonely boy to Proserpina, the queen of the underworld, who of course falls in love with him because he's so beautiful, even as a boy, as a child. She then no longer wants to part with him, which brings Venus displeasure. Jupiter resolves the situation by decreeing that Adonis should spend a third of the year with Proserpina, a third with Venus, and the last third at his own disposal, which Adonis then grants to Venus. Adonis is thus mythologically really linked to the cycle of the year, but Ovid doesn't really mention this version of the beginnings of Adonis. He does not mention that episode. For Ovid, Venus falls in love with the young hunter because Cupid accidentally injured her with an arrow. She loves the young and beautiful boy so much that she, although she is a goddess of love, is even hunting with him, which you can see in Virgil Solis' illustrated version of the Metamorphosis in the background on the left. Have a look here. Here is the couple, and there they are hunting a stag. Ovid wrote, I quote, "And she cheers on the hounds, chasing things safe to hunt, hares flying headlong, stags with deep horns, or their hinds." End of quote. So the love to Venus, the love of Venus to Adonis really transformed her in a certain way. At a certain point, Venus warns Adonis not to chase anything that might turn against him. In the print in the background on the left, therefore, is a boar visible as an example of such an animal ready to attack when being attacked. On the right, Venus' chariot, which you see here, is waiting because after the warning, the goddess leaves her love to fly to Cyprus. Adonis ignores the warning. Together with his dogs, he attacks a wild boar, which fatally injures him with its tusks, ramming them deep into Adonis' groin, and I quote Ovid, "flung him dying on the yellow sand." End of quote. Venus hears the groans of the dying young man as she is flying high in the air to Cyprus in her chariot drawn by swans, or sometimes by pigeons, as you see here in the version of Antonio Tempesta, as pigeons are other animals sacred to Venus. And I quote again Ovid, she heard from afar the groans of the dying boy, and turned the white birds towards him. When from the heights she saw the lifeless body lying in its own blood, she leapt down, tearing her clothes and tearing at her hair as well, and bat at her breasts with fierce hands, complaining to the fate. End of quote. In the once imperiale painting, not an imperial one, the painting of Giovan Vincenzo Imperiale in Genova, known only through the copy here on the left, Venus' companions are showing these expressions of mourning. You see the one enlarged, tearing her robe and taking her hair, ruffle her hair, and here the one which is tearing her cloth. In Ovid, Venus also swears to commemorate Adonis every year, and from the blood of her lover, Venus creates the short-lived Adonis rose, which I brought you here. It's an anemone, not a poppy, thus resonating with traditional ideas of nature awakening and annual cultic celebrations. Here the version in red, as red is the color of love, but there are many colors which blossom in spring. And it's interesting to know that it is not a very long living flower into which Adonis is transformed. But back to Rubens. As we've seen, Rubens seems to have been preoccupied with the more emotional, complex moments of the myth. Even if you see here some plants, there is no real Adonis flower, no rose in it. That's not what he's interested in. For him, drama and love are the most important things. He chose either Venus lamentation for Adonis, or the very crucial moment when the goddess tries to stop Adonis from setting off on the hunt, which Ovid doesn't tell at all, but to which Titian famously gave pictorial expression in several versions. Of course, you know all the painting in the Prado, which Titian sent to the Spanish king Philip II. It was part of a series called Poesie, and is really a landmark in art. You might have seen the wonderful exhibition here at the Prado in 2021, the Mythological Passions, which offered the enormous pleasure to see the Poesie hanging together again. In 1628 and 29, during his second visit to Spain, Rubens had that pleasure too, and copied the Venus and Adonis painting of Titian, so he knew this version really very well, and it was a sort of renewed impulse to work with this idea Titian had invented. And he kept the copy after Titian till his death in his collection. Unfortunately, we lost that one. Titian was a little bit, or his contemporaries, some of them were irritated by the fact that he shows here the wonderful goddess of love from behind, from the back. Actually, he is quoting here a very famous antique relief, but he explains it to Philip, saying that in combination with the Danae you still have at the Prado, this makes perfectly sense and leads to a sort of paragone where paintings have the same possibility as a sculpture to show different views of the wonderful human body. Due to the many existing engravings after Titian paintings, I show you here one of a Venetian engraver called Giulio Zanuto, created in 1559. It was generally relatively easy to know and study Titian's idea. The so-called Antwerp sketchbook, which with copies based on Rubens' lost notebook, contains a cursory sketch after Titian's Venus, after one made while Rubens was still in Antwerp before setting out for Italy, and therefore based on an engraving. So Rubens clearly had started to study this groundbreaking composition of Titian already in Antwerp before he went to Italy, and was then attracted by Titian's idea again during his second Venice visit in the Prado. The painting really had quite an impact on him. In the late horizontal formatted Venus trying to restrain Adonis from departing for the hunt, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Rubens took his cue from Titian. His version was really rightly regarded as a sort of response or homage, as he starts from Titian but creates something new. Stylistically, in the 1630s, Rubens was already close to the late Titian, who also worked with the very expressive open brush strokes. And although Rubens actually took Titian's composition as his starting point, he created something different with it. He shows a fundamentally different couple relationship, one which appears more loving. Although in comparison to Titian, here has already physically detached himself more from Venus. Have a look at that section. And how close the bodies are in Titian's version. The proximity of the heads in Rubens is closer and is more decisive, it suggests an emotional or mental closeness that Titian did without. This approach also means that Adonis does not look down on Venus in quite the same way as he does in Titian's work. I already mentioned this slightly irritating moment to show the goddess of life from behind the goddess of beauty, which also gives life, but is famous for her beauty. She's shown from behind in this slightly weird position where the goddess will fall if Adonis succeeds to leave her. Titian actually quasi-quoted this famous relief I show you on the right side, known as the bed of Polykletus, so there are different ideas behind it. And it's a point where Rubens really decides to opt for another way. By showing Venus from the front, Rubens refrains from this idea instead. In this regard, he drew inspiration from a print. Specifically, he likely saw an engraving which was long regarded as a work by Crispin de Paz, but is now attributed to Barbara van den Broek, engraved after her father Crispin van den Broek. It was published around 1600. The posture of Venus, from this navel onwards, have a look at this section and compare it here. It is just as consistent as the folds of drapery on which Venus is sitting, although in Rubens this extends further upwards and down on the lower right. The idea of placing Venus on the mouth of Earth is the same or similar in front of a forest, and also to open the landscape on the left behind Adonis is very similar. Rubens did use antique sculptures, of course, as a source of inspiration here too. Adonis' back view can be derived from the Dioscuri in Rome. After all, Rubens considered these sculptures to be exemplary for bodies in motion. We know that because he mentions it in his theoretical notebook. In addition, their back view had already been widely disseminated from 1573 onwards through engravings in Lafreris' publication Speculum Romane Magnificentiae, the respective sheet having been engraved as early as 1546 on the left. But Rubens knew, of course, the original sculptures in Rome, here on the left, and the detail of Lafreris' print in the middle. I flipped both, so they are easier to compare with Adonis. And with his astonishing memory, Rubens might have remembered this sculpture even without the illustrated book. If you wonder about Adonis' face, or rather his head, which is a little bit flat on the back, it is indeed not the one Rubens had painted. Have a look at the X-ray, where it is flat. I think a painter in the 18th century wanted to change that. We have a lot of copies from the 18th century of the Metropolitan Museum showing all this a little bit flat head, which probably was the original way how Adonis looked. This one is a copy of a painting once in Paris. In the early, large and vertical format painting, Venus trying to restrain Adonis from departing for the hunt in Düsseldorf, Rubens depicted a somewhat different moment. Adonis is still hesitating. He has already seized his hunting spear, but he is still half-seated next to the goddess. The little Cupid on the right is holding two dogs. The second one is not that good visible, but there is one. And he's staring at the couple and gently touches Adonis' leg. He seems to have presentiments about Adonis' fate. He doesn't really look happy at all. But the pair of swans behind the couple, which you see here, is still very much in love, whereas Venus has wrapped her hair around Adonis and is trying to hold him. One of the reasons why he still seems to be very hesitating is probably this closeness. Adonis doesn't really seem to want to leave her, although his regard is already very sad. Look at these fingers. The way he touches her arm is just not strong enough. With this 2 finger, he will never be able to remove Venus' arm from him. For the beautiful body of Adonis, Rubens probably was inspired by the Laocoon group he studied very intensively in Rome. Laocoon is sitting in quasi the same way. Rubens just mirrored their position and changed slightly the angle of view, which is a typical working method for him to make an illusion not too plump. After all, the beholder should have the possibility to recognize the sources. In Italy, Rubens had probably also seen some paintings and drawings of the subject by Luca Cambiaso, and that's perhaps why he decided to use the portrait format, which the Genoese artist really preferred for this subject. I brought here a drawing by Cambiaso of the Cincinnati Art Museum on the right side, where Venus' pose is very similar to that in Rubens' Düsseldorf painting, though she is really more behind Adonis than on his side. Both may have been influenced by the famous ancient sculpture of the Farnese Bull, which is a colossal marble sculpture group representing the myth of Dirs, first wife of Lycos, king of Thebes. She was tied to a wild bull by Amphion and Cetus, the sons of Antiope, who wanted to punish Dirs for the ill treatment inflicted on their mother. You see here Dirs presenting herself in this rather twisted way. Cambiaso seems really literally quoting this female body, whereas Rubens changes the position of the goddess' left leg in such a way that it's more parallel to Adonis' leg, suggesting harmony with this. And in that way, the couple is still closer to each other too. Rubens' painted composition of the Lamentation of Adonis each show Venus accompanied by 3 almost completely naked females, who were often described as the 3 Graces. So it was in 1648, just a few years after Rubens' death, in the earliest description of the painting, now only known through the copy, in the inventory of the collection of Gian Vincenzo Imperiale. And I quote, Adone morte con Venere e le grazie di Rubens. Adonis' death with Venus and the Graces by Rubens. Like the Adonis myth, these companions of Venus are associated with spring and are usually depicted completely naked in Rubens' work. In Ovid, Venus is alone without companions, so one needs to look for other sources for this 3 ladies. A painting by the Tintoretto workshop shows Venus, here in blue, like the Madonna in front of the corpse of Christ, fainting into the arm of her companion. In Ovid, Venus doesn't have companions, but there are other important sources. In that case, it was Francesco Colonna's Hypnerotomachia Polyphili of 1499, a Renaissance literature, where 3 nymphs weep with Venus, who indeed faints when seeing the dead Adonis. Please also note the dog here on the right side and the way it is looking at the drama. I think Rubens might well have known this painting because there is one greyhound in the Jerusalem painting in a similar position, but we will talk about the dogs later. In our context, the bucolic writer Theocritus has often been mentioned as the author where to look when one wants to deal with Venus and Adonis, because he describes annual rituals in honor of Adonis in his Idyllion, which was very famous in the 16th century, but also even in Rubens' time, and had a lament poem attributed to him as Idyllion number 30, which was even translated between 1603 and 1609 into Dutch by Daniel Heinius, which means in Rubens' immediate circle, and shows how much attention was paid to that poesy at that time. In this idyllion called The Dead Adonis, Venus orders the Erots to tie up the evil boar and bring it to her. You have that scene here on the left in an anonymous print after Giulio Romano. The animal was infatuated with the youth's marble flesh and actually only wanted to kiss Adonis. He had fallen in love, but if a boar is kissing, this can result in a fatal injury from his tusks. Venus is mourning in the central axis here, while on the side, nymphs and Cupid take care of the dead Adonis. On the other side, you see this scene with the boar. This print was very well known, and there is one painting in the Fitzwilliam, one drawing in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which was long thought to be retouched by Rubens, until Jeremy Wood declassified the revision as a work of Erasmus Quilinus, which is still quite close to Rubens. Anyway, the wild boar didn't interest Rubens at all. There is no rule in any of Rubens' surviving paintings for this animal, just as little as the anemone or roses, which is created by Adonis' blood. There are other antique texts very important, and here I brought you an edition of Greek bucolics, from which we know that the brother of Rubens, Philip Rubens, verifiable, bought that edition in 1605. Where the bucolic writers Theocritos, Bion, and Musk are in, and there is also this wonderful text of Bion called Epitaphios Adonitos, Lament for Adonis, which was long attributed to Theocritos. It's a little bit complicated, the story of attribution of the bucolic poets, but Rubens surely knew that text. Translations were published in Flanders as early as 1565 and 84. And it's a really touching text where Bion sensitively and extensively describes the almost human emotions and reactions of the goddess of love in the face of the dead Adonis. I think this is why it had such a big success. An aspect important for Rubens. There is a touching description of the last kiss Venus is giving Adonis, who no longer is able to feel this last kiss, and I quote, "But Adonis does not know that she has kissed him when he is dead," end of quote. Dutch artists soon took up the theme of Venus' last kiss, for example, in the 12 engravings after episode in Ovid by Johannes and Lucas van Doeticum, where you see the couple in the foreground in an antique landscape. And on the other side, you have Franz Floris really focusing on the kissing scene and the despaired goddess of love. This last kiss was alluded to by Rubens in the early lamentation of Adonis. I really think that Venus is just going away from his face, moving away from his face. And in one of the drawings, namely the one in Washington, showing the goddess leaning upon her dead lover with this antique gesture of grieving, holding her face. I mean, nowadays we don't grieve in that way. She's holding her face in her hand with one Erot holding Adonis' body and a very sketchy Cupido trying in vain. It's really sketchy, but I hope you see it the same. Trying in vain to help Adonis applying a bandage. In this drawing, Rubens has put a hasty sketched kissing scene on the upper right. There, this last kiss. And he commented it even with words, "This is the handwriting of Rubens." writing Spiritum morientis excipit ore, which means the breath or spirit of the dying she receives with her mouth, which is quite a strong picture of such an intense moment. This comment by Rubens is not a literal quote. Arnold Ballis referred to the use of literary excerpts with regard to the inscription of the kiss scene. After all, in Lomazzo's Trattato dell'arte della pittura, this Italian painter had already in the 16th century recommended making literary excerpts and a working method with which Rubens, who really read a lot, was quite familiar. But where did he take this from? In Ovid's Ars Amatoria, we find the following passage on the death of Procris, which could resonate in Rubens' words. There it starts, exit et incauto paulatim pectore lapsus, excipitur miseri spiritus ore viri, which means she dies and her breath, which has gradually escaped from her careless breast, is absorbed by the mouth of the sad man. Enclosed a drawing by Giulio Romano, which doesn't show the kissing scene, but the death of Procris. Moreover, a passage from the Metamorphoses uses similar words, protinus Hilonome morientis excipit artus, which means immediately Hilonom takes up the dying limbs, describing the death of Silarus. So it's really not that unusual picture to describe a dying scene. Evers and Liz McGrath referred in this regard to Cicero's Verrine orations, where spiritum ore exciperet liceret also use similar words and describe the last wish of those mothers whose sons were killed is expressed in really similar words. Rubens used similar words too in a view of a sarcophagus with Venus and Adonis, so he really linked that idea to this couple of lovers. This sarcophagus he probably has seen in Rome in the collection of Scipione Caffarelli Borghese. I'm really sorry that I didn't manage to get a better photo. But I put a drawing of the right side of the sarcophagus where the last kiss is shown, and which seemed to have triggered this idea, because there he wrote, seeing that sarcophagus, he wrote, Lui expirant et rendant l'âme quasi dans la bouche de Vénus qui s'approche pour le recevoir, end of quote. He wrote there, his passing out and last breath, as it were, into the mouth of Venus, who approaches him to receive it. This is the other Adonis sarcophagus Rubens knew for sure, from the collection of Vespasiano Gonzago in Sabionetta, and where the idea of the last kiss, in my opinion, is even more clear. Unfortunately, you see that Venus has lost her head in the course of time, but I think she was originally kissing Adonis. You see, he's already injured. The Cupids try to help him. I think she kissed him because she's still touching very gently his cheek. This sarcophagus clearly follows, in some aspects, the text of Bion. But returning to Rubens' Jerusalem painting, which is also influenced by Bion's text, there again we have this very gentle touch of Adonis' face, and behind Adonis, whose bloody traces of his wound are placed here in a way that he seems to be castrated now. Behind this Adonis, you have these three companions grieving in various ways, thus communicating the actual extent of the pain in a very varied way. While Venus appears to be covered in tears, but still very restrained in her display of grief, And next to the three companions, we have Cupid standing on the right at Adonis' feet, disposing of his quiver of arrows in despair. After all, it was one of his arrows that had accidentally wounded the goddess of love, thus provoking Venus' feelings for Adonis and finally also her grief. Let me quote Bion's description of the scene. Georgios Adonis lies in crimson-dyed sheets, and around him the weeping loves groan aloud, cutting their hair for Adonis. This one was throwing on arrows, this one a bow, another one was bringing a feathered quiver. End of quote. I show you some details so you can even have a look at the otherwise not that visible tears of that painting. Here a close-up of Venus. Her companion has tears on the face, but even here on the shoulder, which I find a very beautiful idea. And the other one is full of tears too, whereas the little Cupid is really sincerely despaired. For the central nymph, I'm talking about this, an engraving of Franz Flores. Diana and her nymph, surprised by Actaeon, could also have provided a suggestion, even if Flores' nymph in the background. Here you have the detail I want to talk about. Even if this nymph is trying to shield Diana from the eyes of Actaeon, while Rubens' nymph is intent on giving Venus a last glimpse of Adonis' dead body. So they are doing similar things, but intending different things. Of course, both artists, Flores and Rubens, quote here the famous crouching Venus sculpture, of which you have also a very nice version in the Prado Museum. But Rubens may in fact have known Flores' painted original, now unfortunately lost, which was in the collection of Charles de Croix, 4th Duke of Ascot, at Beaumont Castle, together with other erotic paintings by Flores, as well as by erotic paintings after Titian. And Rubens had tried in vain to sell de Croix his Juno and Argus in 1611, but the Duke had known Rubens' father and owned the Apostle series of Rubens, most probably the one you have here in the Prado. And it's very probable that it was de Croix who ordered the series. So it was a very early patron of Rubens. Now to the dogs. Joachim Rosen attributed these dogs of the painting in Jerusalem to Franz Neiders, a colleague and friend specialized in animal paintings. He indeed collaborated with Rubens, for example, in the painting Simon and Iphigenia in Vienna. I brought you here a detail with a wonderful monkey, where the way the fur is very vividly characterized by short brush strokes is typically of Snyder's animals. But the dogs in Jerusalem, I hope you remember the Tintoretto dog, which was a little bit like this one. These dogs are, in my opinion, done by Rubens himself. In the painting in Jerusalem, the dog in front sniffing or even licking here, the blood of Adonis in the foreground, is very close to the one in the painting in Düsseldorf, and this makes the whole things a little bit complicated because these dogs are quoted by Rubens himself, they are quoted by Franz Neiders, they are quoted by Willens. They are really a big success. Everybody is convinced that they are very well done dogs. The type of head, if you compare this with the Jerusalem painting, is really similar, identically, only the colors of pelt differ. In the Jerusalem painting here, Sharon Tagger examined the painting selectively with XRF and found that in the back, a relative large amount of silica had been added to lead white. This could speak for a second artist, as the painting technique thus differs somewhat from the rest of the picture. However, it could also have simply been done by Rubens himself, so that the paint would dry faster, because silica helps to dry the paint. And it would be easier to bring at least some texture into the fur. I have to become a little bit more technical for just one moment. A canvas is usually coated with a quick drying oil paint in ochre brown or reddish brown. Most of the time this was done by a canvas primer, not the artist himself. When Rubens returns from Italy, almost invariable, a second layer of oil paint called imprimatura is applied in a cool gray tone. Usually, Rubens uses his brush strokes economically, working also with this toned imprimatura, which he uses as a color value itself. Have a look at here. I hope it is visible that the grayish tones here lie underneath the rose and the white and the brown color. It's really typical for Rubens to do this, and this is why I believe that these dogs were painted by himself. And if you look here at the dog's nose, you see that there is some reddish color, which is indeed an indication that the dog is meant to be licking Adonis' blood. In the painting in Jerusalem, the dog in front sniffing or slicking is very close to the one in Düsseldorf, this one. On the left side, the type of head is identically, only the pelt differs in, yeah, I have to go further. There are dogs indeed rightly attributed to Snyder's, as the one here in a painting done by Rubens' workshop in collaboration with Snyder's in a painting now in Darmstadt. And also this on the right side is a painting surely done by Snyder's himself. And if you have a look at these dog heads, which are close to Rubens' dogs, you see that the pelt is somehow more shaggy and has much more structure. For me, in my opinion, this really shows a big difference. There is a wonderful painting in the Prado, which was for me very revealing in trying to understand the differences between Snyder's and Rubens. It's this recognition of Philopomen from around 1609. It is probably the first collaboration between Rubens and Snyder's, and chronologically not that far away from the painting with Venus and Adonis and the death of Adonis in Jerusalem. The Prado painting shows a story of Plutarch's parallel lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, the life of Philopomen, who is a Greek general here in disguise, very modestly dressed in red, on the left side, who helps the mistress of a house who hadn't recognized him and had therefore asked him to split woods. I rotated the swan wing on the left to make a comparison easier for you, because in that way it's nearly in the same position like the painting in Düsseldorf. And have a look, compare it a little bit. It's really interesting to see the differences here. The swan in the Prado is less expressive in its plumage. It's clearly a wing which wants to express something different than Rubens' attitude. it's much more accurate. The individual feathers are very accurately depicted in their characteristic surface structure, while in Düsseldorf painting on the right side, the feathers are vigorous brush strokes and aim less at the precise depictions of surface structure. Rubens seems to be more interested to give a more general and definitely very impressive impression of a powerful wing, whereas Snyder seems to have studied each single feather. In the late painting of Venus and Adonis in the Metropolitan Museum, the dogs are also clearly executed by Rubens, but of course they look very different to the early dogs, as in the meantime Rubens really has developed, has become much more expressive with brush strokes, and also his color palette has changed. The colors are impressively bright and cheerful, and yeah, I think it's a wonderful example that he is actually interested to paint animals himself. Back to the antique poet Bion one last time. There it also says, and I quote, "But Aphrodite, Venus, having let down her hair, rushes through the woods mourning unbraided, unsandaled, and the thorns cut her as she goes and pluck sacred blood." End of quote. Rubens depicts this scene here. It shows Venus from behind standing on her left leg. She has lifted the heel of her right foot and bends towards the viewer to pull a thorn out of her heel. In this unstable, very twisted position, Venus is surrounded and supported by 4 arrows. One of them holds her injured foot. A second provides support for the goddess' knee with his back. On the left, a weeping arrow, probably Cupid boy himself, is very sad, but tries still to give her support too. And on the right, the 4th arrow leans on a rock and points towards an undefined flower. I hope it is visible. It's this one, which is now mainly red, but still has white traces at the edge. The flower is just in front of the standing arrow and is the clue of the scene of the subject. It's a reference to a rose that has been dyed red by the blood of the goddess. You see how much blood is running down. Venus' soul is covered with rivulets of blood. Therefore, this is the depiction of the origin of the red rose, which is closely linked to Adonis myth. On the left, here detail I'm talking of, the evening sky and bushes are reflected in a body of water. As the whole painting in that section is rather sketchy, it's not that easy to recognize immediately, but there surely is a body of water, which means that there is a bathing aspect in that story. The story of how the rose was colored is formulated in antiquity by Adonis' rhetoric textbook called Progymnasmata, an antique text which was studied in Rubens' time already in school, so he surely knew it. And recently the antique Geoponica have been suggested as a source too. And at least Albert Rubens, Rubens' eldest son, owned a version of that, and I'm sure that Rubens studied that most likely in school too. In both of them, Venus' blood is coloring the rose red, but the depiction of water doesn't work with these texts. None of them mentions any water in the story. Here again, it's Francesca Colonna's Hypnerotomachia Polyphily providing an important impetus for this. Here, an illustrated version of the or an illustration of the Hypnerotomachia polyphily. Colonna describes a sarcophagus relief at Adonis' grave, which depicts a scene which had once taken place at the side of the sarcophagus. Venus had bathed there in a rose garden, which is indicated here, and had injured herself when she rushed barefoot to the aid of Adonis, who in this version of the story is still living. So there's really a decisive difference between the way Ovid tells the story and the way Colonna depicts it or tells it. And here also Adonis is attacked by a jealous Mars. Venus definitely had a little bit too many lovers, so jealousy was easy to rise. Mars is depicted here right in persona, so it's easier to understand that it is him who is killing or who wants to kill Adonis, and he finally succeeds in doing so. And Colonna is describing a little bit later in the scene, Cupid collected the youth's blood in a shell, which was ritually buried together with his ashes under this sarcophagus. A little later, in the course of the annual festivities in honor of Adonis, Venus' blood is spoken of again. In her grief over Adonis' death, Venus remembers the reopening wound on her foot caused by rose thorns and solemnly is dyeing a bouquet of white roses red with the blood. The subject, which is rather rarely depicted, was decisively inspired by Raphael and his circle. He and his workshop designed a scene for the famous Stufetta, the bathing room of Cardinal Bernardo da Bibbiena in the Vatican. There, the scene is based on Colonna's Hypnerotomachia polyphily, as this theme was an obvious choice for a bathing scene. The depiction was engraved by several artists and thus gained wide distribution, among others by Marco Dente, here on the left, where Venus sits in side view, pulling the thorn out of her foot, and in another version inspired by Raphael on the right, the Master of the Dees shows Venus instead seen from behind. The goddess of love sits in a landscape on a rocky bench surrounded by roses. One foot is propped up on the thigh of the other leg. In both depictions, the focus is on the more or less nude, seated female body in a landscape. There is no reference to Adonis and there is no Cupid. The story is only the pretext to present a wonderful body. Only in an engraving by Giorgio Gysi after Luca Penni, Venus is standing. In the background, the jealous Mars is pursuing Adonis, while in the foreground, Cupid is sleeping. You see it here and there. Wonderfully armored Mars. The goddess of love seems to have just gotten up from the bath and fallen into the middle of a rose bush. She's really full of roses here, which is also between her legs. This corresponds to the 1554 French edition of the Hypnerotomachia polyphily, which located the wound, because of a translation error, on the thigh. So you see, sometimes translation errors can have quite radical effects. Along the bottom of the print is written in Latin, I translate, I'm wounded by deadly spikes all over my body and the rose has turned crimson with my blood. The reason is sweet love, but I care not about my wounds as long as I snatch the youth from cruel hands. So it's really a wonderful way to express the Venus love. And you see that in using Venus standing, Rubens is quite, it's the closest way. To give you an idea how original Rubens has created that Venus and the Thorn scene, have a look at Giulio Romano, a fresco at the Palazzo Te, where Rubens, of course, stayed when he was at the court in Mantua, so he knew this fresco for sure. And Giulio Romano here too used the Hypnerotomachia as source of inspiration. But the coloring of the rose is hinted only in a small detail. One sees Venus trying to hold Mars, stepping on a white rose. I give you a detail with a bleeding foot. Cupido is sitting on the ground looking at the goddess of love's foot while holding a red rose in the right hand, allowing the viewer to construct the story. I mean, this here, it really starts to be a little bit, there's a lot of humor in that scene, which Rubens was not interested in. Rubens takes a distinctly different approach with his Venus, removing a thorn from her foot. His Venus is not firmly seated, but rather standing. And I think he wanted to show that many erodes to have different possibilities to express emotions of the protagonist. Venus has drawn her eyebrows together in irritation, but it's Cupid who is crying on the left. And for this Cupid, Rubens has found a wonderful source of inspiration. The image of Cupid wiping the tears from his eyes with his right hand, like a little child, was probably inspired by an ancient Roman work, the Bound Arrows, from which a lot of versions exist. I show you here the one in the Galleria Borghese. And it's interesting to see how these ancient subjects were interpreted, because not always the interpretation is that clear. This one was described in 1619 as a, I quote, schiavetto che sta piangendo, which means a weeping little slave. The little boy shows a similar elegant hip accentuating contrapposto. I mean, again, he mirrors the sculpture. And it's typical for Rubens that he twisted his Cupid also in the upper part to make him more lively. He really loved motion. Motion and movement. This ancient sculpture was very well known. A similar Eros was described and illustrated from both the front and the back by Sandrart. And here, Sandrart interpreted it as penitentia per aver troppo parlato, which means a punishment for having talked too much. So he goes even more far in his interpretation. But where does this very challenging motif of a twisted standing Venus come from? On the left, you see one of the sculptures which was proposed for this, an antique bronze statuette of Venus balancing on her left leg and grasping her right heel with her right hand, which has been interpreted as depicting the removing of the thorn. Actually, it is she grasping the sandal, which is clearly recognizable here, the classical antique sandal. It's a special form from an ancient female statue. It's often interpreted as Venus untying sandals before bathing, for example. However, Rubens' Venus corresponds, in my opinion, more closely to this in Rubens' days, a more modern version, probably created in the workshop of Giambologna. Giambologna is probably the source of it. It has been preserved in several bronze statuettes with different details, sometimes attributed to Antonio Susini, sometimes to Giovanni Francesco Susini. Here you have a version where she could dry her foot with this towel, but it's also imaginable that she tries to pull away a thorn. So it's not always that clear. You would really need the original in your hands to have a close look to decide what is represented. But what is clearly very similar to Venus' version is this twisting of the body and the position of the arms, which Rubens obviously was very interested in. So in this way, Rubens incorporates contemporary influences, as the Giambologna workshop was still active in the first decade of the 17th century when Rubens was in Italy. And to come to an end, let me finish with this beautiful bozzetto, as it was all about the creativity of Rubens, how he deals with different sources. This bozzetto shows a very first idea, a first draft, an oil sketch where you see that the dogs are not that clear yet. The round is located in a different way, but in general, the position of the protagonists are already very clear. Rubens' exploration of the myths surrounding Venus and Adonis show his inexhaustible creative power, with which he repeatedly merged the widest varieties of sources and models, from antiquity to Renaissance and the contemporary, in order to create new pictorial inventions. In doing this, he used various media, as I showed, sculpture, painting, graphics, and literature, and showed new aspects of the myth. The focus hereby is always on emotions, which he powerfully and yet very complexly and dramatically makes tangible to the viewer, so that one can see the story of the unfortunate goddess of love and her beautiful lover in a new light. Thank you very much for your attention.